Rant reading A Serial Killer. Juan Corona. Juan Vallejo Corona, February 7th, 1934 to March 4th, 2019, was a Mexican serial killer who was convicted of the murders of 25 migrant farmer workers found buried in shallow graves in peach orchards along the Feather River in Sutter County, California, United States in 1971. At the time, the crimes were characterized as among the most notorious in the history of the United States, until the discovery of Dean Corll's victims 2 years later after his own conviction. Corona was the deadliest American serial killer by number of proven victims. Corona was convicted of 25 counts of first-degree murder in 1973. An appellate court overturned the conviction in 1978 on the basis of incompetent legal representation and granted him a new trial. In 1982, he was again found guilty of all 25 homicides. He served out a life sentence in California State Prison, Corcoran, and died in 2019. Early life. Juan Corona was born in Alton, Jalisco, Mexico on February 7, 1934. He first entered the United States in 1950, crossing the border into California at 16. He picked carrots and melons in the Imperial Valley for 3 months before moving on north to the Sacramento Valley. His half-brother, Natividad Corona, had immigrated to California in 1944 to work and settle at Marysville across the Feather River from Yuba City. Corona moved to the Marysville-Yuba City area in May 1953 at the suggestion of Natividad and found work on a local ranch. Corona was first married to Gabriela E. Hermaloza on October 24, 1953, in Reno, Nevada. In 1959, he married Gloria Moreno, and they had 4 daughters. Mental breakdown. In late December 1955, a flood occurred on the Yuba and Feather Rivers. It was one of the most widespread and destructive of any in the recorded history of Northern California. A rush of water broke through the West Levee and flooded 100,000 acres, killing 74 people. Corona was apparently suffering from an episode of schizophrenia on January 17, 1956. Natividad had him committed to DeWitt State Hospital in Auburn, California, where he was diagnosed with schizophrenic reaction paranoid type. Apparent recovery. He received 23 shock treatments before being pronounced recovered and released 3 months later. Upon his release, Corona was deported to Mexico. In 1962, Corona returned to the U.S. legally with a green card. At this time, he stopped drinking. Aside from schizophrenic episodes and a reported violent temper, Corona was regarded as a hard worker. This same year, he became a licensed labor contractor. He was in charge of hiring workers to staff the local fruit ranches. In March 1970, Corona was again admitted to DeWitt State Hospital for treatment. A year later, in March 1971, he applied for welfare. His application was denied. Evidence. On May 19, 1971, a farm owner who had used Corona to contract field workers noticed a freshly dug hole in his peach orchard, which was filled the next day. In the hole was found the body of a man who had been stabbed and hacked. In one grave, deputies found 2 meat receipts bearing Corona's signature. In another 2 graves, there were 2 crumpled Bank of America deposit slips printed with Corona's name and address. This circumstantial evidence gave an added boost to the case. Witnesses later told police that some of the victims had been last seen riding in Corona's pickup truck. In the early morning hours of May 26, 1971, police entered Corona's Yuba City home with a search warrant and arrested him. Evidence indicating his guilt was discovered and seized, such as 2 blood-stained knives, a machete, a pistol, and a blood-stained clothing. There was also a work ledger that contained 34 names and dates, including 7 of the known victims. The ledger came to be referred to as a death list by the prosecution, who alleged it recorded the dates the men were murdered. Corona had been supplying workers to the ranches where the victims were discovered. He housed many of the men who worked for him in a bunkhouse on the Sullivan Ranch, where most of the victims were discovered. Victims. All of Corona's victims were middle-aged Caucasian male drifters between the ages of 47 and 64, except for 3. Most of them had criminal records, and all but 1 were stabbed or slashed with a knife or machete. Legal proceedings. Corona was provided legal aid and assigned a public defender, Roy Van Dien Hovel, who hired several psychiatrists to perform a psychological evaluation. Although the sheriff, Roy Whitaker, said the prisoner was in no apparent or immediate danger from his fellow townsmen, Corona was moved to the new and larger county jail in Marysville on May 30th, 1971 for security reasons. On June 2nd, Corona was returned to Sutter County for arraignment, which was closed to the media and public. A plea of not guilty was entered and a date was set for Corona's preliminary hearing. By the time the search was terminated on June 4th, a total of 25 male victims had been discovered. 4 of them were unidentified. On June 14th, Van Duhovel was replaced by Richard Hawk, a privately retained defense attorney. In return for his legal representation, an agreement was made granting Hawk exclusive literary and dramatic property rights to the defendant's life story, including the proceedings against him. Under the agreement, Corona waived the attorney-client privilege shortly after taking over the defense, and even before seeing Corona's medical record or reading any of the reports, Hawk decided against having him pled not guilty by reason of insanity and fired the psychiatrists. Corona complained of chest pain from his cell in Yuba City on June 18th and was taken to the hospital where he was diagnosed with having a mild heart attack. The grand jury returned a 25-count murder indictment against him on July 12th. In early August, Corona was hospitalized again after complaining of chest pain and saying he had not been able to sleep because of it. Trial. It took over a year after the murders were discovered for the case against Corona to come to trial. The California Supreme Court voided the death penalty in the state February 18, 1972, ruling it unconstitutional, cruel, and unusual, therefore it would not be a capital case. Hawk succeeded in getting a change of venue from Sutter County to Solano County. The trial began on September 11, 1972 at the courthouse in Fairfield, California, more than 60 miles from Yuba City. Jury selection took several weeks and the trial another 3 months. Though Corona denied culpability, he was not called to the stand to testify in his own defense, and no defense witnesses were called. The jury deliberated for 45 hours and returned a verdict on January 18, 1973, finding Corona guilty of first-degree murder on all 25 counts charged. The judge, Richard Patton, sentenced Corona to 25 terms of life imprisonment to run consecutively without the possibility of parole. Despite being sentenced to many consecutive terms, the Department of Corrections said that Corona would be eligible for parole in 7 years, citing Section 669 of the Penal Code, with mandates that when a crime is punished by life imprisonment with or without the possibility of parole, then all other convictions shall be merged and run concurrently. Corona was first incarcerated at Vakesville's California Medical Facility 9 miles from Fairfield because of the heart irregularities. In 1973, he was stabbed 32 times in his cell because he had bumped into a fellow inmate in a corridor and failed to say, "Excuse me." Of the 5 men questioned, including the one involved in the bumping incident, 1 identified as the man's sexual partner and 3 inmates identified as friends of the partner. 4 were charged with assault with a deadly weapon. Corona was transferred to Correctional Training Facility, CTF, in Soledad, California. In 1974, his wife filed for divorce. It was granted on July 30th. Second trial. On May 18, 1978, the California Court of Appeal granted Juan Corona a new trial based on his appeal and petition for the writ of habeas corpus filed by his lawyers Alan Axelrod and Michael Mendelson. The appeals court based its decision on 2 primary issues raised by appellate counsel. First, trial counsel did not do the requisite legal and factual investigations required. Second, trial counsel's obtaining publication rights as part of his free created an impassable conflict between trial counsel and Juan Corona. The second trial began on February 22, 1982 in Hayward, California. Corona's defense posted that the real murderer of the ranch workers was most likely native dad Corona, a known homosexual who was accused of attacking Romero Rhea at his cafe in Marysville, and after losing the lawsuit Rhea filed, had fled back to his native Mexico. Natividad had died 8 years earlier in Guadalajara. This time around, more than 50 defense witnesses were called to the stand by Helene. Corona was called in his own defense. He was asked only 2 questions through an interpreter, taking only 2 minutes. "Did you understand the state has accused you of killing 25 men? "Yes," Corona answered, almost inaudibly. "Do you have anything to do with these killing of these men?" "No," Corona replied. Helene then turned Corona over to the prosecutor, Ronald Fahey, for cross-examination. Startled prosecution attorneys requested a brief recess to gather their wits and prepare some of the more than 630 exhibits for their cross. Later, Fahey questioned Corona about various vans and cars he used at the ranch where he worked and where he lived, in which some weapons were found. The trial lasted 7 months. Corona was again convicted of the crimes on September 23, 1982, and returned to prison after the strategy failed to persuade the jury, which deliberated for 54 hours over a 2-week period of his innocence. Afterward, the foreman told the press that the most incriminating piece of evidence against Corona was his work ledger, for which the labor contractor had no reasonable explanation. He said the jury had dismissed the defense contention that Nineveh had committed the murders. He wasn't in Marysville enough to have committed the bulk of the killings, he said. Later years in death. Corona was transferred from CTF at Soledad to Corcoran State Prison, Corcoran, California, in 1992, where he served a life sentence in the Sensitive Needs Yard, SNY, because he had dementia. He was denied parole 8 times. Corona died on March 4th, 2019, aged 85, by natural causes.